All right, I hope you're enjoying the course so far. Today we are talking about malware, everything malware. So this is straight malicious software. There's different forms. We're going to cover all sorts of different ones today. We're going to actually look at some of them. We'll get a little bit into how they actually function and achieve their goal, and tell you also how you can protect yourself from it. So let's dig in. All right, so when we're done with this lecture, so in an hour, you will understand all of these things that I kind of just alluded to, how viruses work, Trojan horses, rootkits, the different versions of viruses, etc. We will talk about buffer overflow attacks, which is kind of like the, classic attack of some sophistication on systems. It's evolved over time, but we'll talk about the fundamental basic buffer overflow attack, which really every cybersecurity professional should understand. All right, so viruses, how do they work? Why do they work? How are they deployed? You got to think too, like viruses, malicious software, worms, Trojan horses, they all have these like kind of ominous names. But in reality, they really are just software doing exactly what they are programmed to do. So software like Microsoft Word or Notepad, they are pieces of software that are written to perform a function. And really, malicious software is no different. It's just the intent and the objective of what the software is doing has malicious consequences for victims. Now, viruses are interesting because they are kind of named after, traditional human biological viruses in that they replicate. They often need kind of a host to replicate. And this is one of the things that kind of differentiates viruses from worms is that, yeah, they can spread quickly, very transmissible, but it needs some kind of host file, host application, host platform. We'll spend a minute talking about Sammy Kamkar's MySpace virus and how that worked, but that used the MySpace platform and like cross-site scripting as a technique for replicating. We'll talk about the I Love You virus and how that used email and a weakness in VBScript to replicate. But really the key thing for you to understand is when you hear virus, understand that it's self-replicating, moves quickly, and needs kind of a host in order to operate. Now, there's a couple ways that viruses will spread. You can see here we talk about network connections for it to propagate itself across the network, or mailing itself, which you see this less common nowadays, but before Outlook, which was a popular application, before Microsoft kind of made Outlook a little bit more hardened and other email applications, it used to be quite prevalent for a virus, much like the I Love You virus, to get onto a system, pull down all the contacts in someone's Outlook, and then use Outlook in Visual Basic script to basically send everyone in your contacts list a specifically crafted email that would typically have a malicious payload in it, and then send it out. And obviously it's quite successful because when you get an email from someone you know or trust, you're more likely to open it. So occasionally you'll still get an email. You yourself may have gotten an email from someone that just seemed weird, and they're like, oh, I didn't send that. But I feel like nowadays that's less virus and more compromised email accounts where someone gets into your email because they get your username and password, and then they email everyone some canned email message asking for you to do something, right? As far as network connections and spreading, that is true. Again, worms kind of spread on their own, but with the virus, network connections, we talked about it in the networking lecture. You've got these services, right, at layer 4, the transport layer, that are listening, waiting for connections. Well, once a machine is compromised, it can scan the network and look for other systems that are listening and try to propagate through those network connections. A good example is the WannaCry virus, which really leveraged Double Pulsar and Eternal Blue, which were NSA tools leaked in Vault 7 leak. If any of this is interesting to you, this is like in the last 3 years, you should totally Google it. Vault 7 NSA leak, Eternal Blue. But anyways, it was looking for SMB shares that were, accessible on a network, and it would scan, find it, attack, move, scan, find it, attack, move. So, this is kind of that technique for viruses moving. And part of the reason why when you're hardening your computer or your network or anything like that, you should definitely only have listening services that are services that you need to accomplish some goal, not just, whatever, the base install of whatever it came with. So email propagation, again, I already kind of spoke about this, but, Microsoft has this language called VBS, Visual Basic Script, and it's kind of integrated into their Office suite, so you can write macros, they're called VB script, in Excel, PowerPoint, Word, and Outlook. And that's kind of what the mechanism is that this email propagation was taking advantage of. Again, this is a little less common nowadays because Microsoft has gotten serious about security, very serious, and they don't allow stuff like this really to happen anymore. Now, website delivery, I'm going to skip network because I already spoke about that, but website delivery is another interesting technique. And this one I do see more often nowadays, but this is where, well, it can be two ways. One, it's called watering hole techniques, where you visit a website and your web browser is actually vulnerable to some exploit. The website will kind of scan your browser, see if it's vulnerable, understand if maybe because you can tell what the operating system is also when you're looking at the browser. Scan that, find out if it's vulnerable to an exploit, and then deliver the exploit and kind of compromise the browser, and then maybe move forward or just do things in the browser. So that is one technique. Another is to actually swap out valid executables with malicious ones. So occasionally you'll hear this too, where someone's downloaded, Winamp or some open source tool, right? Like Nmap. We did Nmap Lab. You can download that tool from nmap.org. Well, if a malicious actor swaps those out and actually, has a malicious payload, maybe a Trojan horse, so it's still Nmap, but there's malicious functionality in it, you're still likely to download it. So it's on you because you're actively, you're the end user in this case, you're actively engaging in downloading that file. Now, as far as going to a watering hole site, that's more important to keep your web browser current on updates, but that's another technique for virus delivery, okay? So let's talk about the different types of viruses, right? Not all viruses are the same, and basically it's the way that they function or the way that they attack your computer that kind of differentiates them. So let's run through these kind of keywords and understand different types of viruses, okay? So macro viruses, these ones are very popular even today, right? You'll actually notice that by default, macros are not enabled in Microsoft Office products, and you'll get like when someone puts macros in a document, if you've ever seen it, it'll pop down and say, hey, like, you can't see this. Would you like to enable content? That is asking you, would you like to execute macros on your computer? Macros, like VBS, which is what macros are written in, gives a lot of power to the developer in order to make system function calls. So if you're not careful, obviously malicious software can run and do escalate privileges and do some bad stuff on your computer. So macros, fairly easy. You see them quite a bit. Now, boot sector viruses, this is interesting. So without getting too deep into computer science, the way operating systems work, I mentioned before in an earlier lecture that there's BIOS, like firmware, that will kind of load the operating system. But the operating system kind of has its own things too. So the boot sector is kind of the first part that goes in, and it tells the operating system where, like, system files are, like the things to get it up and running. Think of it as like a pilot light to light the big fire, which is the operating system. Boot sector viruses will attack this specific area, and we're going to talk about one in a minute, Shamoon. But boot sector viruses are pretty nasty. If you mess around in the master boot record, you can totally destroy a computer, denial of service type attack. And that's what Shamoon did. And, you just got to be careful. Like, you don't see, at least in my experience, you don't see a lot of boot sector viruses, but they are incredibly damaging if you do get one. A multipartite virus, quite simply, it's like a hybrid virus. It'll attack the boot sector and kind of the main operating system or an application or something like that. So multipartite is just kind of a blend of a couple different viruses, or it's a virus with multiple functionalities. Now, armored virus is quite interesting, and you can kind of have these stacked together, right? So you could have an armored macro virus that's also multipartite because it attacks all these other things. But an armored virus is interesting. You don't really hear the term armored virus. You hear more of the term of like sophisticated malware, right? And essentially what an armored virus is it is software that makes itself, it's almost self-aware of an analysis or reverse engineering. So when you send a virus out, let's pretend we're bad guys. You send a virus out, you infect a person. Yes, mission accomplished. Another person doesn't get infected because a security practitioner prevents it. Well, the security practitioner may analyze that virus to understand what is its functionality, what is its kind of indicators of compromise, so you can look across your own network and say, is this virus anywhere else? And if it had run, you can understand kind of the full scope of what this virus actually does, so you can recover, whatever. Like if it successfully runs and it overwrites files, right? You can go back to your backups and restore those files. You're not guessing what the virus does. Well, some of them are so sophisticated that before they start executing, they will actually look and say, am I in a virtual machine? If I'm in a virtual machine, which is basically an abstracted operating system that runs on top of an operating system. We don't have to get into that, but you can have like your main computer, and then you can have like multiple virtual machines running, which are like computers unto themselves. Anyways, when you're analyzing malware, you definitely use a virtual machine. That way, if it gets out of control, you can just melt the virtual machine down and have no damage to your actual main machine. Well, if it detects it's in a virtual machine, it'll shut itself down. It'll also sometimes look at the running processes, which is like what applications are currently running. And if it detects like common reverse engineering applications, like IDA is a popular one if you're looking to get into malware analysis or reverse engineering. Anyways, if it detects certain processes running, it'll shut itself down, or it'll erase itself, right? Some of them go as far as that. So, it's like next level of sophistication on these things. Memory resident, you'll hear this term. You'll also hear like fileless malware. So a lot of us commonly think of malware and viruses as like files that run on your computer, right? Like an executable or something like that. Well, more sophisticated malware will actually run in memory. And again, without getting too deep into computer science terms, like your RAM is where things are running in your computer. And when you have files that are typically on your hard disk, when you want to do something with them, you have to load them into RAM. That's why when you have more RAM, your computer's faster, because it's not needing to switch things. Well, some malware will actually write itself like in memory. So like it's not like you download the full malware. You'll download some type of little program that will write the malware into memory and then run there. That way, if you were to stop the computer or you were to pull the hard drive, you wouldn't actually find any type of malware on it, because it's not archived or stored off. It's literally running in memory. That's again a bit of a sophisticated technique, but it's becoming more common. A sparse infector is basically a virus that will run given certain conditions. So a lot of times, this is actually quite common nowadays. You'll see like Russia attacks Ukraine pretty often, actually. And you'll see a lot of malware that is written where it'll basically attack a machine. And the first things that it does is look at what the keyboard language is, right? So we all, if you've ever kind of initialized something, one of the early things is like, what language, English. You pick it and you move on. You never think twice about it. Well, that is a configuration setting. So some viruses will look at what is the language that the operator is interfacing with the computer on, And if it is anything other than, the Ukraine language, I don't know what that language is, but if it's anything other than the Ukraine language, it just stops work. It stops itself from moving forward, right? And if it is a Ukrainian language, it continues the operation. So that's kind of a sparse infector. It's basically like making a logical decision on whether or not to move forward. You can also see ones where it'll be like, a random time interval, like, between 0 and 45 days, I want to run. And this just makes it more difficult to detect because it doesn't have any kind of heartbeat or beaconing or anything that's kind of like more computery and less human-y to make up terms. Because computers kind of operate with a very predictable cadence. Polymorphic is also interesting. It's a little less effective nowadays because we've moved into heuristic-based detection for viruses versus signature-based. But polymorphic viruses essentially rewrite themselves each iteration, or commonly each iteration of the virus, in order to avoid detection. And the idea is classic antivirus detection, like you run a little semantic antivirus on your computer, Norton, and you were downloading definitions every day. Those definitions are basically fingerprints of files. So the file, if it gets rewritten every time that the virus iterates, it gets a different fingerprint. So those definitions getting pushed down aren't going to do anything to protect you from that virus because it's always a brand new file. That's what polymorphic is. It's just a technique to avoid being stopped, right? Here's a couple examples just to kind of show you if you wanted to dig in, right? Semantic. This is the Windows So Big virus. And it says it's a worm, but I mean, essentially the same thing. So this is an example of one that propagated through email using VB script, right? You can see, again, these are like indicators of compromise, right? So it came from big@boss.com. So you could put a rule on your email gateway saying reject all emails from big@boss.com. This is like how defenders can quickly, operationalize their environment to start preventing techniques like this. Now, if the malware author just changes the from person in that email, which by the way is super easy to change, then that defensive technique does not work, right? So you got to be kind of agile and on your feet. Again, here's just another one from Sophos, kind of highlighting that there's different vendors out there that provide guidance and updates on different viruses and malware. Now let's spend a second talking about the I love you bug, right? This is the I love you virus. This was written by a developer in the Philippines, and actually there was no law like in the Philippines that made this illegal, so he ended up not going to jail or anything. But basically, this was a VB script email attachment, and the name of the file was love letter for you. Now, the interesting vulnerability that this attacked was when you attached an attachment to an email, the way that Outlook rendered the file name was it would go until it saw a period, and then it would include the next 3 letters, right? Because it was kind of like hard-coded and mistakenly thought, oh, like a file name is some words or a string of characters, period, 3 letters for a file extension. So let's display it that way. This is a great way for like innovative thinking on how to attack systems or use systems in ways they weren't intended. The author wrote a VB script that basically would allow him to steal credentials from victims, and he named it loveletterforyou.txt.vbs. Now the VBS is the VB script file or VB script file extension. And if you look at this, it's clear as day that this is VB script. But the problem is when you look at it as an attachment in your email, it said loveletterforyou.txt, which is a text file. Most people are not afraid of a text file because that's all it is text. It doesn't run code. So, people would get this, they'd open it up. It would basically infect your machine. It would email everybody in your contact list the same virus, same file name, and propagate out that way. Now, he originally only had it in the Philippines, and then he opened it up to the world. and it spread incredibly fast. Like this was like everywhere, in a few days. And it actually ended up, because VBScript is written in English, it's like an interpreted language basically, which means you can open it up and look right at it. You don't have to compile it. A lot of people took it, and it was very trivial to change what the functionality was without changing kind of the propagation engine that it was using. So fairly quickly, a lot of malicious people started weaponizing this in different ways, and then ultimately it got resolved, but it was a hot mess there on fire for a week or so. And just another good example of email propagation, how quickly viruses and worms can move. Now, there are virus hoaxes. Again, I don't see this as often anymore, but it was quite popular where, you don't even write a virus, but you start a hoax saying like, oh, like this particular virus is going around. Watch out for it. Here's a subject line. Now, why would you want to create a virus hoax? Well, a couple reasons. One, if you were malicious, you could prey on people's fears and say, hey, there's a virus out there. It's called the CS227 virus, and it's going to corrupt your system. It's like the I love you virus, right? But if you download this executable, it will protect your computer. But really, this executable is malware that's going to steal your banking credentials or something like that, right? So you can kind of weaponize by preying on people's fears to get them to do what you want, which is social engineering, but it's using viruses as a technique for that. Now, this is the Robert Morris. This is just a Wikipedia page, but we'll talk about the Morris worm here for a second if you want to check it out. This is one of like the original worms. So like viruses and stuff, they kind of existed, but like in the 80s, people really didn't know about that. Again, security wasn't a big thing. The Morris worm was one of like the seminal events that really got people thinking about computer security at scale and needing to really think about how we protect the internet. So Robert Morris was a student at the time at Cornell. He wrote a simple computer program that like did a buffer overflow, so we can talk about that in a second. It also like had default credentials, like it would check to see default credentials were available and stuff like that. And anyways, his entire goal, he claims, was to highlight computer insecurity and also to kind of see how big the internet was at the time. And basically what this worm did, it really didn't do anything malicious, right? It ends up being malicious, but not intentionally. What this worm did was it would look for computers on a network. It would exploit doing a buffer overflow on a binary called finger-D, which you could run kind of remotely, or it would try default credentials, weak credentials, no credentials. Like back in the day, you could just like log right on without even giving a password. If it was able to get on the computer through any of those means, it would install itself on the computer and then rinse and repeat and go across. Now, as part of the defensive mechanism for Morris to kind of protect this thing from getting out of control, he had the worm look at the running processes on the computer at the time, and if it detected the Morris worm was already running, it would not install itself, thinking, okay, like this machine's already been compromised, I can move on. Well, he was under the assumption that a way to protect or a way to like mitigate his worm for like going out and doing what it did was for system administrators to kind of create a fake version of the Morris worm binary and have it running in memory, so then it wouldn't install itself, right? Like you would trick it into not installing itself. So he put in 14% of the time, right? It would do like a random number generator, and if it was like 1 to 100, and if it happened to be between 1 and 14, it would not check if it was installed. It would just install itself automatically. Okay, so if you want, pause, think about this for a second. What could go wrong with that? Okay, I'll tell you what goes wrong with that. Computers are incredibly fast. The internet is incredibly fast. What ended up happening was in a very short amount of time, this worm would install itself on that 14% happened more often than you would think. And he ended up installing the Morris worm like lots of times on single systems, but like at scale. And he ended up essentially doing a denial of service attack on a huge chunk of what was at the time the internet, and basically brought systems down. Because if you have 10,000 Morris worm executables running on your computer, it's just hogging your system resources, your processor, and your RAM. And that's effectively what happened. He did get in trouble. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation. He's actually a tenured professor at MIT right now, so it didn't screw up his life. But that's the original Morris worm. So some modern examples of viruses that you may have heard of in the news. These are great examples. WannaCry, which is ransomware, but it actually leveraged that Eternal Blue NSA weapon that I told you about. But this one basically was attacking OpenSMB shares across the internet. Is really quite fascinating. I think it happened in like 2017, and it was wild because it started in Eastern Europe and started moving west across as the day started that day, as people were turning on their computers at work. I remember being in the United States at the time and hearing like Europe's like getting crushed right now by WannaCry. Like, you need to not turn on your computers or make sure that SMB isn't open to the internet. Like, this is important. It was a crazy day that day. So Petya is just another kind of ransomware. Ransomware is like very, very popular right now. You can look at that one. I believe Petya was one that actually targeted just Ukraine. Like I mentioned before, kind of that sparse infector. And Shamoon was massive. So Shamoon actually targeted Saudi Aramco, which is the largest provider of petroleum fuel in the world. And this one was nasty business. This is almost like industrial espionage, where the virus that attacked, or Shamoon, which attacked Saudi Aramco, was basically a boot record wiper. So it would go in, it would get in the boot record, it would clear the whole thing out, and basically render that computer inoperable. You would have to rebuild the whole computer, which, that's inconvenient, but like put it across like a multi-billion-dollar, 80,000 person company. And how long does it take to install an operating system and rebuild it and get it configured back to the way it was? Let's just say it takes one person one day to do one computer. So amplify that by 80,000 endpoints, plus you got all your servers, and you can begin to understand the significant impact that had on Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco actually invested incredibly heavy on cybersecurity after this. I got called by a recruiter. They were going to give me a lot of money to move to Saudi Arabia. They actually built like a campus that looks like Phoenix, Arizona over there. So they were spending a lot of money. If you're interested in more information on Shamoon and Saudi Aramco and that whole thing, I strongly encourage you to check out a podcast called Darknet Diaries by Jack Rhysider, which actually just each episode covers like an interesting story in cybersecurity, but he has a 3-part series on Shamoon where he interviews some of the head person of cybersecurity who got brought in right afterwards, and she built like this amazing team and everything like that. But that's, again, if you want to go a little bit deeper on this particular topic. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so rules for avoiding viruses. Like, we've definitely highlighted how bad viruses are, so let's talk about how you don't get them, right? Use a virus scanner, sure. Endpoint detection and response tools are kind of common in the corporate world right now. Antivirus scanners are more of the residential end user one. They're good practices. Again, signature-based antivirus is kind of the way of yesteryear, and behavioral-based virus scanners are the more common one. And when I say behavioral-based, let me just explain what that is. So viruses behave a certain way, right? They will typically either get on the system, try to elevate privileges. Maybe they'll like inject themselves in an existing process like Microsoft Word, or you'll see Google Chrome open like a connection to some weird international server somewhere but like it just doesn't make sense based on the behavior of the computer. And the virus software will intervene and maybe quarantine that process or alert you to it or something like that. That's what behavior-based antivirus is, right? And that's why like polymorphic viruses can't stand a chance against behavior-based, because it doesn't care what the file hash is or what the file looks like. All right, another best practice, right? Don't open questionable attachments. Like, you've probably heard this a million times from your cybersecurity office during end user awareness training. Like, this is quite popular, right? There's all sorts of, anyone can send you an email, right? It's very kind of trivial to get an email in front of someone, and they'll, like the I love you virus is a good example of a questionable attachment. Any like office document, macro laden things. You'll see PDF, the way that your PDF reader renders PDFs can be kind of attacked. So just be cautious of really who's sending you email and what the attachments are, okay? And then don't believe security alerts. Yeah, a lot of social engineers will attempt to use fear, uncertainty, and doubt, urgency of time, and scare tactics in order to trick you into either opening attachments or taking some action. So just be aware of that. Ransomware. Yeah, so you should know about ransomware. That's definitely like the most prevalent malware right now attacking our society. Ransomware takes advantage of encryption, which is a technique that we use in order to protect the confidentiality of data. So encryption is a good thing. But malicious actors will actually encrypt all of the files on a computer, a victim's computer, or they'll encrypt the entire computer, operating system, and everything. And they'll leave a note saying, hey, I've encrypted your computer. It will cost you X amount of dollars, typically in Bitcoin, to unlock the computer, or for us to give you the keys to unlock the computer. Here's a email address that you can reach us at if you have any questions. And here's a Bitcoin wallet where you can send the ransom. And then they'll do nasty business like, if you don't pay us in 24 hours, the ransom will double. If you don't pay us in 48 hours, we're just going to delete all your data. And it's migrated a little bit or evolved where now it'll be, don't pay us in 24 hours, we'll double it. Don't pay us in 48, we'll leak it to the press, or we will sell it on the black market, or we will release it directly to your competitors, kind of depending on what the data is that has been stolen or ransomware. So ransomware is very, very ongoing right now, and we really don't have a good way to, we have a couple technical mitigations to kind of reduce the impact of ransomware, but we don't have a way to stop it. And a lot of the threat actors executing ransomware are operating with impunity in countries that aren't going to help us stop it. All right, so this is kind of a word wall, these two, but I just wanted to highlight a use case example. You can Google this. They're attacking municipalities. So Atlanta, Georgia got brought down, like their airport got brought down. A couple other things got brought down due to ransomware back in 2018. It was interesting because it was SamSam ransomware. A lot of ransomware will be kind of delivered via email and attachments, but SamSam actually, they scan your network looking for open ports. Once they find one, they get in. Then they go across your entire network, laying malware or ransomware throughout the network, and then they execute it all at the same time, kind of like a logic bomb. It's very, very devastating. So these two individuals had an indictment put out on them. As far as I know, they haven't been captured. But Atlanta was kind of dragged through the mud because they had actually had an incident earlier, and they were, they didn't really do anything to kind of remedy the situation or invest in it. Another one that just happened not too long ago that you may have heard of is Colonial Pipeline, which basically feeds fuel for the entire southeastern and central eastern United States coast. And, basically their IT got ransomware pretty gnarly by dark side threat operators or cyber threat group. And people were like going bananas for fuel. Like there was a run on gas stations. So the ransomware doesn't just impact the organization, it can have like societal consequences as well. Now, let's talk about Trojan horses, because we did mention this the other day. Basically, it's a program that looks legit, but it's got some type of other capability or functionality to it that you may not know about, but it's definitely there, right? So Keylogger is a popular one. That's like where it just records your keystrokes, like when you're typing in your username and password. and sends it to the threat actors. It says open a backdoor for hackers too. Yep. Like that's kind of more of a rootkit, but basically allowing malicious actors to kind of enter your system at will. And that's kind of what a Trojan horse does. Another really kind of gross example of a Trojan horse to give you guys some more context is so I mentioned Russia and Ukraine are constantly in conflict. Well, allegedly Russia, wrote a app for Android that helped calculate like pitch and trajectory for firing mortar rounds. Now, why would they do this? Well, they wrote it in the Ukrainian language. They released it in Ukraine, and a bunch of mortar gun turret operators in Ukraine downloaded the app. And yeah, it was awesome because all you had to do is type in or touch on a map where you wanted to target where you were, and it would tell you exactly how to, like, you know, configure your cannon to nail whatever that target was, right? It did all the physics for you, math calculations. Super awesome. The problem was that it also was reporting back to allegedly Russia the exact geographical location of where that phone was. And if you're calculating mortar rounds, your chances are you're standing right next to the mortar, the cannon, right? Which basically was putting a target on themselves, which allegedly Russia took advantage of to eliminate all of those weapons and military capabilities of Ukraine. So that's another example of kind of how a Trojan horse could be lethally weaponized in a military capacity. If anyone's interested in that story, Wired did a really interesting write-up on that. Just ask me if anyone's interested, and I will get you that story, okay? Yep, so obviously you've got to be decent at programming. There are some like apps that can help you embed two apps together and have one of them look like the real app and the other one is hidden. But, company policy should prohibit unauthorized downloads. You should always be careful. Like, this is the reason why Apple App Store has like such a walled garden, if you will, to protect people from downloading stuff like this onto their iPhone. And this is, in Google Android, Google Play Store, they are less scrutinizing about who can publish in their store. And it really becomes kind of an interesting philosophical question, like, should Apple have the right to determine who gets in their store and who doesn't? Because there's a financial and business thing there, and Apple does take a piece of every sale. But you could argue that they are providing that level of scrutiny and I guess qualifying the apps that are in there as safe and secure. So I don't know. It's an interesting topic. Here's just a cert advisory on a Trojan horse. I'll leave it here. You can freeze it if you want. This is an older one from the late 90s, so it's kind of more just here for an example. Okay, so let's talk about a stack overflow, right, or a buffer overflow. You can do buffer overflows with stack and heap, but I don't want you to get overwhelmed by this, okay? This is not what we're looking at is how the attack is going to happen. I don't expect you to understand what you're looking at, like the actual graphic. I'll walk through it, but this is like year 2 of a computer science program, what we're looking at. Like, this is not an entry-level cybersecurity thing. So this won't be on any test or any quiz, but just bear with me because I want you to understand what a buffer overflow attack looks like. A lot of the viruses and stuff that we've been talking about is like running code the way it's designed, and it's just the difference between like a virus, like a good piece of software and a bad piece of software, but it's still software. A buffer overflow is a completely kind of different animal altogether. And a buffer overflow is basically exploiting a buffer overflow vulnerability that is discovered in a application. So the way that, as a very quick level set here, the way that computers work is things are loaded in memory, right? And you have a processor, and the processor can run one command at a time. Now, the faster the processor, the more commands it can run, or the faster it can run commands, right? So like when I say one command at a time, it's probably running like 10,000 commands a second, right? So it's not, it doesn't seem like one at a time to us, but that's what's happening. It goes on the processor, gets executed, moves, and then a pointer moves through memory to tell to basically tell the processor what the next command is to run. So where to look in memory. So what we're looking at right now, this vertical column is memory, right? And you can see calc.exe at the top. This is the calculator program. Now, if you think about a calculator program for a second, let me do this. Okay, if you think about a calculator program for a second, right? It can take in a text field, right? I'm putting numbers in. Now, whatever the numbers are that I'm putting in, when I hit plus, 5, that 76,000 number I just had is stored in some variable somewhere, right? It knows it. The computer program knows it. It's stored somewhere, and then I put in another number, and then it called a function. The calculator program called a function of add, and it added those two numbers and then returned back into here. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is how buffer overflows work. This area right here, this field of where it's taken a number, right? It can only take so many numbers, right? Like I can keep typing numbers, but at some point it's got to hit a threshold, right? And this is input validation. But let's just assume for a second that it didn't take an upper limit. I could just keep typing numbers in here. Well, in memory, when we called the calc program, it had to allocate memory to handle whatever number we were going to type in, right? But because memory is finite, it had to say, okay, I'm going to carve off 64 bytes, right? Let's just say there's 64 blocks here in green. I'm going to carve off 64 bytes because the number that they're going to put into the calculator has to be less than 64 bytes. And I will protect that because if they go over 64, I'm going to error out. I'm going to tell them that doesn't work. I won't accept a 65th number. Okay? Well, here's the thing. If developers don't put in that validation check, it's possible to overflow the allocated memory that was set aside for the value that's going to be pushed in through the front end of the calculator. Okay? Now, what does this mean? Well, okay, so here's where we're about to get into like how the actual attack works. You're putting in the numbers, right? And it's going down, it's fine. Say this is the last number you put in, then this is all just dead space, no big deal. Well, at the bottom of your memory, because you've allocated that 64 bytes, at the bottom of the memory is this return address in red, okay? And the return address is telling the instruction pointer, which is what is telling the processor where to look next. It tells it, hey, go to this space in memory. So when you're executing, you go straight down, unless there's a return address, and then you follow where the return address is, right? Think of it as like I said earlier, when you're adding the two numbers, we're running the calc program, but when you hit plus and add the second number and hit equal, it calls a separate plus or add function, calculates it, has the value written to memory somewhere, and then does a return address back into the calc program, and then the calc program knows to look in that return address for the sum of the addition function, and then it displays it or does whatever it's going to do. Okay, so that's how the program's supposed to work. Now here, let's get crazy, okay? What if I told you that you could put in all this that you wanted, and then you actually make the return address somewhere up in here. So instead of going back to wherever you came from as you should, you actually come right back into the stack. Now, why would you do that? Okay, here's why you would do it. Instead of me pushing numbers, if I actually put some type of malicious call here, or I opened a program, or I opened a network connection, or I did whatever I wanted, right in here, and I have the return address come back up into here, it is going to execute that code. Okay? So that's basically kind of how a Stack Overflow works. And like once it gets up here, because it's just going to execute one after another, it's going to start executing my commands. And then if I wanted to be elegant about it, I could copy off this return address and put it right here and have it go here. But in reality, once it starts executing my code, you'll hear like a lot of times with vulnerabilities, it'll say like, it allows the attacker to execute arbitrary code. You'll hear that all the time. That's what this is saying. I can put anything I want in here and it will execute what I want it to do. And oftentimes you don't need to go to a return address anymore because you've taken over the computer and you're going to start having it do what you want to do. So this is exploiting a vulnerability versus using a software in a way that it wasn't designed. Okay. So again, you're not going to have to execute a buffer overflow for this class. I just wanted to explain to you a little bit about how a buffer overflow works, because you'll hear buffer overflows all the time. Like it's a common enough thing that I wanted to spend a minute and tell you what it was. Okay. And that was kind of like a cursory high level overview, but that's basically what it is. Okay. So a buffer overflow attack, yeah, like if they detect one, this is a Microsoft Security Bulletin. I know you can't read that, but basically if they detect one, it basically means that you can execute anything you want in there. If it's on a internet facing, like a listening service, right? Think about when you connect to, I don't know how often you guys are connecting to like Secure Shell or something like that, but imagine, if you will, that you connect to a web server, right? Web servers are always listening. Well, what if that web server had a vulnerability that allowed a buffer overflow attack? Because instead of sending, like the TCP, the first SYN flag, you sent something that did a buffer overflow attack on that listening service, right? That would be pretty nasty, because then you could attack that machine without really, from anywhere in the world, attack many of those machines anywhere in the world. So that would be pretty bad. So you'd want to make sure that you patched that software. And the way that happens is the developers will put in a validation check on the size of that past variable, and then make sure that it can't overflow into the return pointer. All right. Oh, and by the way, like buffer overflows are so common that like there's like written tutorials, there's tons of YouTube videos. Like if you want to learn how to write a buffer overflow, there's a ton of resources out there for you. Again, even in modern day, humans make mistakes and developers are writing the code for these systems. So you'll see buffer overflows. It's not uncommon. They still happen quite a bit today. So spyware. We spoke about creepware a little bit. Spyware is like that, although it can be used in espionage. If you look at Patrick Wardle's Fruit Fly Mac OS X talk from DEF CON a few years ago, that's an excellent example of spyware. But basically keyloggers for what you're typing and screen captures for what you're looking at. Now, it's not always cloak and dagger and espionage, right? There are legal uses for spyware, and some that you might even argue are appropriate. So I myself am a parent. You can bet that until my kids are buying their own tech, there are acceptable use policies and standards that they'll have to comply with if they want to have a phone or have an iPad or, whatever. And monitoring their use is something that I do, right? Like, who are you talking to? Well, like, bedtime's at 9. You can't use your iPad after that. And then if I detect activity on the iPad after 9, then, I know for a fact that they're breaking the rules, right? So there are use cases. Obviously, illegal would be deploying it without the consent of the actual technology owner and doing it for espionage purposes. And this happens all the time, especially in the commercial industry, pharmaceutical, R&D, higher education, research, because I think we do a whole lecture on this. But, if you think about it for a second, the value of some research is the cost of the time it took to develop it plus the value to market. So think of like the COVID vaccine, right? If you're a country like North Korea, for example, that is kind of walled up and not really interacting with the outside world per se, developing your own COVID vaccine might be very, very difficult, but and take a long time, a lot of money. But if you steal one, you don't have to develop it. You can just like basically get the final solution and start producing it yourself. So that's why people do spyware and espionage type things like that. There is spyware removal tools. Again, this is like an older idea. Things have kind of progressed and evolved since then, where spyware is basically just seen as any other kind of malware and malicious software. And most of the primary tools that we run, antivirus, webroot, Malwarebytes, EDR solutions for corporate environments will detect spyware as just another piece of malware. So, okay, rootkits. Rootkits are pretty nasty because if you get a rootkit on your machine, you can never trust it. You can never trust that machine again until you absolutely wipe it and rebuild it. Okay, so a rootkit basically gets into the operating system. And the reason that you can't trust anything is because everything you're looking at could have possibly been manipulated by the rootkit, right? It allows, all this stuff. Rootkits are like basically the gold for malicious actors because you can get into the system, you can, change audit logs, you can change passwords, you can create new accounts, you can hide software on the computer, you can do all sorts of stuff. So rootkits are bad business. Web-based mobile code is another form of malicious software. Basically, if you think of like Flash, right? Flash was kind of an example of this, where Flash was written by, I think, Adobe. And it was basically made so you could run like really interesting stuff on different operating systems, mobile, desktop, etc., like that. From the web, the problem is Flash had all sorts of security issues, and it was, people are writing poor code because they're being told, like, we need to get to market soon. You have 2 weeks, to develop this software, and it's got to do X, Y, and Z. And, X, Y, and Z is all functionality, but like A, B, and C are security things, but you don't have time to do A, B, and C because you're being paid and directed to do X, Y, and Z. So you end up having a lot of buggy software, and it's no good. Occasionally you'll hear, if you want to consider this web-based code, occasionally you'll hear of like font rendering vulnerabilities. So if you've ever heard of someone, I can brick your phone by sending you a text message because the way your phone renders the font or the glyphs that I send you, that there is some truth to that. But just, it's just another form of a virus, basically. Logic bombs, we talked about this in the first lecture. I won't spend a ton of time, but logic bombs basically are keyed to go off at a certain condition is met, usually a time. Like I mentioned with the SamSam ransomware, they dropped it all in the environment and waited for a certain date. In fact, right now, this is like breaking news. Like today's July 3rd. Yesterday, July 2nd, there was a talk of a major managed service provider, which is like outsourced IT, having their supply chain compromised, and ransomware being by the REVIL group being just deployed across many, many companies, right? July 4th weekend, mostly junior staff are working because the senior staff are using their seniority to get the weekend off for the holiday. That's another logic bomb, right? They probably had the malware dropped in there a while ago and waited for July 2nd at 8 p.m. to fire off, and there you go. All right, I'm kind of curious for the sake of the group here. I just want to see REVIL ransomware attack, right? Yeah, 2 hours ago. So I encourage you. I mean, this is what I was saying. Like there is every day is a nasty business. This one's particularly nasty. Hundreds of companies hit. Oh, yeah, REVIL, a Russian-speaking ransomware syndicate. Yeah, this is what I'm telling you. Ransomware is no joke. timed for the 4th weekend, July 4th weekend, right? This is not a coincidence. This is effectively a logic bomb, right? They had it lined up knowing that it would be a soft target. It's most unfortunate. All right. APTs. Okay, APT or Advanced Persistent Threat, you'll hear it often called APTs. I think I actually have a discussion for APTs using MITRE ATT&CK framework, but APTs are your best of the best. They're nation state threat actors, like APT 38 is like North Korea's financial attack group, which I would argue they're the most effective and most sophisticated financially motivated cyber attack group. There's APT 41, which is China. There's APT 29, which is Russia. Multiple countries have multiple APTs for different kind of missions and operations and stuff like that. But APTs are the best of the best, right? So that's when we talk about the top of the food chain as far as like sophistication and complexity of their operation. If you want to understand APTs, look no further than the SolarWinds attack. I'll do a lecture possibly on just the SolarWinds attack, which attacked the supply chain of SolarWinds, which is a company that makes products that basically allow organizations to kind of see the health of their entire environment. APTs take a lot of time, they spend a lot of money, and they invest a lot of resources into developing their tool set. You as an individual, me as an individual, if an APT wanted to go after us, we would be unable to protect ourselves. So detecting and eliminating viruses and spyware for normal stuff, right? So scan for virus signatures. Like I said, signature-based definition. If that's what you're running, make sure that you keep it current, definitions up to date. And watch for behavior of executables. Again, behavior-based antivirus. You shouldn't really, you don't need to be looking for registry change settings, which is a Windows thing. Like your defensive security tool set should be looking at that, but just make sure if you're shopping around that is what it does, right? Here's a couple that I have put if you wanted to check it out. Basically AV tools, anti-spyware tools. You could check it out and just, if you're interested in going a little bit further. Okay, so hopefully you got this out of this lecture, right? There is a ton of different malware. Some of it is, quite clever. Some of it is just using the software the way it was intended. And some is taking advantage of weaknesses that developers accidentally missed when they were doing hardening of their software. There are ways to protect against it. Vigilance is key, right? Because you got to keep your defenses up to date and kind of sharp, or else, unfortunately, like if you're not patching your phone and your laptop and stuff like that, eventually something bad will happen. So hope you enjoyed the lecture. I know we kind of dug in deep on this one, and I'll see you in the next one.